Recording it. Great. Well, thanks for joining me, guys. And what we'll do is we'll keep ourselves muted if that's okay, apart from if you want to say something, so then we don't get the background noise. So if you can just mute yourself, and then if you want to speak up, I think there's a few enough of us on this webinar that if you want to kind of chime in when I'm in the middle of saying something, feel free. So just unmute yourself and just speak up. That's fine. If there are questions you want to ask as we go through things. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Maconochie. I'm a Brit, but based in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I actually lead the 3DM team for North America. And so, and I was based in Sheffield at that church where a lot of the kind of 3DM stuff was originally developed. And we're doing all the same kind of stuff now here at Grace Gathering Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana. One of the things that we've noticed over the years is that depending really on your setting, but it's there's often a big challenge for leaders of churches trying to do missional communities, because it really is, especially in the early stages when you first start doing missional communities, it's quite a high bar thing, and you have big portions of the church that just aren't ready for that kind of stuff. And so we want to just think a bit today about what I really want to talk about is what are the ingredients I've noticed in churches that have kind of managed to make it work well, in terms of what they've done for the folks who aren't yet ready for to do kind of full missional community leading. And it depends how high bar missional community leading is. Depends a bit on your setting. So, for example, if you're in a very high population density environment like a major city, then people tend to do community more together anyway, just out of a kind of financial imperative. You have to kind of live with more people and do things together because you just don't have the space. If you're in a kind of Midwestern suburban setting like we are here, then people tend to take a lot of space for themselves, and you can spread out, and it's much more of a kind of cultural shift for people to start doing shared life with other people, and so it often takes longer to get things up and running. So we'll have a think about that. I'm going to put up a whiteboard for the majority of this webinar, and so that means I won't see most of you. I just get a few people on a kind of bar across the top. So motioning at me won't get my attention. If you want to ask me something or whatever, you could either type something in the chat if you wish, or you can just unmute yourself and just speak up, and that's fine too. I don't think we'll get too many people at once doing that. So I'm just going to get going. I'm just going to have a word of prayer, and then we'll get going. So Lord, I just pray that you'd help me to share the right things today, that you'd help us to all ask the right questions. We're all on this journey. We're wrestling with these things, and we want to help our whole church to move on and move from just being believers to being disciples, and also helping people who don't yet know you to become disciples as well. So we just pray that you'd give us wisdom as we talk, and that you'd speak to each of us as we just process this stuff together. Amen. So first, I just want to kind of remind you, this is stuff that will be familiar to most of you guys, just remind you of the bell curve. And my artwork on this, unfortunately, is drawn on a trackpad of a MacBook, so it's not going to be pretty. But hopefully it will be good enough to be able to have a vague idea of what I'm talking about. So if you did a bell curve or a normal distribution curve of people in your church, of kind of pioneers to settlers, I was quite pleased with that until the end where it went all wobbly. Sorry about that. You basically, the vertical axis here is number of people, and the horizontal axis is how pioneering they are, where out on the far right hand side here are the pioneers, and on the left hand side here are the settlers. So generally what you're going to have in your church is you're going to have a few people kind of up at the top end here who are going to hear an idea like missional communities. They're going to kind of think through, does it fit with scripture? Can I imagine myself into it? Does it sound like it's from the Lord? Yes, we're good to go. Off we go. Let's get started. We'll have a few like that. Most people aren't like that. And then down at the other end, down here, these are the settlers. You've got or the developers. You've got people who really they need real evidence that something works before they're going to do it. And of course, God's brought all of those people into the church, and we're supposed to have that whole range. And if we didn't have the settlers, we'd do reckless things and end up getting ourselves into trouble. If we didn't have the pioneers, we'd get stuck in our ways and stuck in a rut. And so it's really important as church leaders that we build a culture that values pioneers and settlers and everybody in between. But generally, those people on that far right kind of segment are going to be the ones that do missional communities. And then you've got kind of everybody else somewhere in the middle to start with. And one of the mistakes I've seen a lot of churches that are going after a kind of discipleship culture make is that they basically just say, right, we're going to do missional communities now, guys, and everything has to be missional communities. And if you do that, then effectively what happens is everybody carries on doing what they were doing before, but just calls it a missional community. So, you still have people doing small groups, Bible study groups, fellowship groups in their homes, but they just say, oh, it's this missional community. So effectively all you do is kind of dilute the language. And I'm much more comfortable personally when there's what it says on the can is what's in the can. So I'm just going to clear that bell curve. And so what we've generally found is a better strategy is to aim for a continuum of involvement. And I'm going to just kind of put that out there. And this would be the first. I'm going to give you a number of ingredients of what I think are important ingredients to help everybody else move on and become kind of disciples. And the first one I'm going to say is that, which is they could develop a continuum of involvement. E.g. gatherings, groups, communities. And that's not that. What I'm putting there is literally just an example. It's not it's not the defining thing. I'm just talking about what we do here at Grace Gathering. So at Grace Gathering we have, and if you look on our website gracegathering.com, you'll see that we kind of even show people it this way. So we have gatherings, we have groups, and we have communities. And the way that we would define that is by the commitment that it takes. So a gathering is a one-off, and it might be, so a Sunday service is a gathering, but so is a youth weekend or a youth camp. So it doesn't necessarily have to be just a single kind of event. It might be a week or something like that. But the thing with a gathering is the only commitment is to turn up at that one thing. So we have what we call an Olympiad in the summer for our teens, which is just a really fun kind of crazy sports day. The only commitment is to turn up for that. So that's a gathering. Groups are where you have a programmatic commitment. So if it runs from 9 through till from 7 through to 9 on a Wednesday, then you turn up from 7 through to 9 on a Wednesday. There's no other commitment. And some groups might be, we would subdivide those groups probably in Grace Gathering. We would probably subdivide them into classes, centralized groups, and home-based groups. So we probably, even within the groups, we've got a range of different groups. And if any of you are interested later, we can talk about that a little bit. But the commitment of groups is programmatic. So it might run every week for 20 years. But if it's only 7 through to 9 on a Tuesday night, and that's all you have to turn up to, then it's a group. Or it might be something that just runs for 8 weeks, following a particular kind of curriculum, and it's meeting in a home as a group, and your commitment is just to go to that. That's a group too. We're just wondering at Grace Gathering whether to distinguish slightly classes from groups, but that's another conversation. But so we might subdivide. We might go to 4. But I like the simplicity of 3 kind of main categories. And then communities we'll almost always have a fixed point. So it might be that there's this community, we primarily meet 6 o'clock on a Friday night, and we eat together and we do our Bible study, we pray together, and we're trying to reach out to certain people and all those things. But the thing that makes it a community rather than a group is that even if it has a fixed point, if you join it, you're committing to do life with those people in a more extended way than just the programmatic commitment. So that would be our Grace Gatherings continuum. And we've just found that what happened at Grace was Chris Norman, the pastor, who is a very gifted leader and a very pioneering apostolic leader. When he first started, he said they had lots of groups and things running. He said, we're not doing any of them. Everything's going to be missional communities now. And when Ellie and I joined the team a few years later, we're in the process of reverse engineering that to put all the other groups back in. Because what happens is, if you only have communities, then when you do have some pioneers who start a community, everyone else is desperate to be in something. And they'll just say, well, look, if communities are all there are, we'll join one of those. And then the people who start a missional community have an influx of Christians. And instead of getting on with reaching out to the last, the least, and the lost, they're busy doing pastoral care of Christians who just want somewhere to belong. And that's deeply unhelpful. And so it's really important that we, as church leaders, do our pastoral due diligence and make sure there are places for people to belong, that more than just Sunday services. And places, and I'm going to talk about this in a little while, it doesn't mean that with groups and gatherings that we're not trying to help people to move from being believers to disciples. It's just that we're doing it on a bit of a slower track. And if you like, with this continuum, we tend to think about, if you think about the parable of the kingdom of God being like yeast in the dough, in a way, this section here, this is the yeast, and the rest of the church is kind of like the loaf. And you do have to put the yeast into the loaf, and you do have to make sure the rest of the loaf is connected with the yeast. You mix it up. So for me, that would mean showcasing communities, telling the stories of communities, helping people to find out what communities are. But you still have to warm the whole loaf if the bread's going to rise. Yeah. And the language that we've used internally, we haven't used this probably with the church as much, but we tend to talk about slow track and fast track. And in a way, leading a church through transition effectively is one of those ambidextrous things where you kind of, it's like, when you pat your head and rub your stomach at the same time. I can actually do that now. I couldn't as a kid. You have to, at the end of the day, probably as a church leader, you're being paid primarily, as far as the church is concerned, primarily to help the slow track, but you're having to protect time to invest into the pioneers so that there is that fast track as well. So everybody can see a picture of what could be, even while everybody is moving on at the pace that they're capable of moving on at. So that would be the first of the ingredients that's really important, I think.
Paul?
Yes, go for it.
Is this kind of like the same idea as Ralph Winter's modal and sodal?
I think slightly different in that I think modal and sodal is about the approach, the whole approach to the church. So, for example, I think that's a question of moving, where you start to ask questions about membership. Where you start to ask questions about kind of belong, believe, behave. At what point do we count somebody as a member? Is it if they're on the journey? Is the direction someone's moving in more important than what they actually, what doctrine they would subscribe to at this point? So I think those modal and sodal questions are really important, but I would say this is slightly different. This could function in a church that has very set, communities, I guess, are beginning to have softer boundaries, aren't they? Communities are always going to have people in them who may not actually ever come to church on Sunday. But generally, I think this can work within a very standard church that has a standard membership structure, those sorts of things, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments on this before we move on? Okay. Well, the second one is obvious, which is that we should is that we need to be doing preaching and teaching on mission.
Before you get too far in there,
Yep.
Paul, Just a question as we're talking about, the loaf and the yeast need to be connected. I love what you say. Everybody can see a picture of what could be and yet be affirmed at the pace they're comfortable with.
Yes.
How, can you give us a couple examples of how we keep them connected and, in other words, illustrate or expose them to everyone without creating a spirit of, or preventing a spirit of, these guys are really doing it?
Yeah, I think what we do is I think what we do is we make sure that they're not the only ones that we're connecting up. So we want the church to know what's going on across the church, don't we? So we're going to be telling good news stories about groups and gatherings as well as communities. I think it's really important, if we're going to do this well, that actually there isn't an implicit value judgment. So, for example, one of the conversations we've had at Grace Gathering is, what defines where you are at any given time, where you choose to be on that continuum, is not just spiritual maturity, say. So, for example, we would hope that as you grow in your spiritual walk with the Lord, that you'd move from only attending church on Sunday to doing stuff with other believers midweek. We would hope that you would do that. That would be a sign of increasing spiritual maturity. But it might be that, for example, when you're in your 20s and 30s, you've been a missional community leader, but now that you're in your 40s or 50s and you have a super busy job and you've got teenage kids and everything else, you just don't have the time to lead a missional community. And for a season, you just need to be in a midweek group, and that's absolutely fine. So sometimes it can be things like that stage of life. What we've found is with missional communities, if I was going to draw a little graph of, and I'll just draw this and then I'll kind of wipe it out again, but if I was going to draw a graph of age along the bottom versus the vertical axis being the vertical axis being how easy it is to function with a missional community lifestyle. So the higher up, the easier it is. I would say that the curve would look something like this. It would go something like this to me. Or ran out of space there. Yeah. And maybe go down a bit towards the end. And so generally, you're going to find youth, young adults, young families, it's really quite easy to do missional communities well. I think middle-aged, particularly middle-aged parents, about that stage of life, you're often at your most busy job-wise. It gets much more difficult to do it around in your kind of 40s and 50s. The weird thing is that if you were to plot on the same graph, which I'll do in red, the kids of any generation, so the kids are generally born about here and go through the same curve. Yeah. So what you often find is just at the point where it's getting really difficult to lead missional community well. It's getting really difficult to lead missional community well yourself. If you've got kids, it's just at the point where what they're doing becomes easy. And I find it's often, rather than running their own missional communities, it's often quite helpful if you've got families with kids, for parents to invest into the friends of teens when they're at that stage. It's often a good strategy to kind of shift across what you're doing during that period of time. But I think it's just worth being aware of that dynamic as well. Any other comments, thoughts, questions on any of that before we move on? I'm aware we've got some people on this webinar who've got quite a lot of experience themselves. So those of you that have been on this journey a long time, if there are things you want to chime in, do that. If there's observations that you want to make as well as questions. Okay, so I spelt discipleship wrong. That's not very good for a 3DM person, is it? So the second one would just be preaching and teaching on mission, discipleship, and community. So you're just, throwing that stuff out. It's marked for parable of the sower. Some of it will fall on hard ground, but you just keep throwing it out there. And one of the things you're doing is you're throwing that out there, is you're kind of interspersing it into the normal preaching rhythms of the church, and you're always looking for where do the shoots come up. So, where are people coming back to you, getting excited about it, talking to you about it? Sometimes you'll get new couples that come in, or new people, new individuals that come into the church, and they respond very strongly to that stuff. Great. Let's make sure that we're forming some language in our church that helps people to engage with this as well. So for us, just the language of gatherings, groups, communities has been very helpful. It means that there is there's a distinction in people's minds between just being a midweek group and actually being a community. It's much more helpful than everyone just calling what they do a missional community. So that would be the second one. The third one would be that we have found that even when you're just talking about groups, maybe it's just Bible study groups based in people's homes, what you can do is you can have a culture of the circle and triangle in everything. A culture of the circle and the triangle in everything. So, for example, you've got some old school person that what they really just want to do is they want to lead a Bible study. And what did Bible study used to mean? Bible study used to mean you gathered at the church, you get someone who was a gifted teacher doing 45 minutes teaching on whichever the Bible passage is, and everybody else making notes. And then you've perhaps got some pre-printed notes with some gaps, and they fill in the gaps to make sure they've learned the things they're being taught, fill in the blanks. What we would want to do is we'd want to say, yes, we'd love you to do that Bible study group. It's wonderful to have gifted teachers like you in the church, but we'd love you to think through what's the up, in, and out component of this. So the Bible teaching is the upward component. Maybe you could, if you're gathering at 7, maybe you could do, desserts first, so that people have 20 minutes to chat, to do some inward dimension, so that particularly if we've got some new people joining, they get to know everybody a bit and so on. And maybe we can identify in the course of the 6-week study where there are missional passages that you're teaching on, and how we can get people to actually process how they're going to engage in that. And then rather than doing filling in the blanks, we'd love you each week to get people to ask the questions: how is God getting my attention? What's God saying? What am I going to do about it? So that there's at the end of the day, if you've got a whole load of your church who are nowhere near doing missional communities, but they've begun to incorporate the triangle and the circle. The triangle, of course, is just the 3DM way of saying the Great Commission and the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. That's up. Love your neighbour as yourself in. Go and make disciples out. So if you've got people who are incorporating up, in, out, and the circle, which is Mark 1:15, the time is now, the kingdom of God is near, repent and believe the good news. Repent, believe, change the way you think, step out in faith. What's God saying? What am I going to do about it? If you've got people just doing those things, then they are moving from just being believers to being disciples, aren't they? Which is our job. So culture of the circle and triangle and everything. Any comments on that one? Any questions on that one before we move on? Any reflections from those who've tried to implement that with across the board? Okay, one thing I'd say there is, one of the implications of that is you at some point, as you build the continuum in your church, you need some of your leaders, at least 1 or 2 of your leaders, who really get the whole thing, who know how to do missional communities, who do all of it, to invest into groups, not just into communities. Because if you only put the people investing into groups are the people who don't want to do communities, you're never going to build that culture in the groups as well. So we're just at the point, Ellie, my wife, has been leading missional communities at Grace Gathering for the last 2 years. We're just talking about whether, we're just asking the question, does she actually need to hand some of that on to some other people for a season and stand with our group's leader, who's doing a great job already, but help them to just make sure that we're really getting that kind of DNA going in those groups for a season. So you do actually sometimes need to put the people who've most got the DNA elsewhere on the continuum from just being up at the high pioneer end, the fast track end. And it's important because what you're doing then is you're creating a leadership pipeline. Because if you have groups that people can join that teach people how to do up, in, out, and how to think, what's God saying, what am I going to do about it, then you're moving people to be towards one day. Some of them will one day be ready to lead communities. And if you just do it with your pioneers, you'll get your communities, you'll get until you've used up your pioneers, and then how are you going to have any more? You kind of got this separate silo of things. So you're trying to create this continuum through the church that helps people move on, so that you're creating a leadership pipeline. Okay, any other questions on that one? We'll have a bit of time to do Q&A at the end as well, once we've done all of them, if you would find that helpful. So the next thing would be evangelistic tools everyone can use. And for me, there are three main categories of evangelistic tool that we need in the church. And this is what I've seen in churches that really are successful in seeing people come to faith. I would say the first is opportunities in the public space, opportunities from the centre, on a Sunday or midweek, whenever it is, but central opportunities for people to just bring people along and know that they're going to hear the gospel and be encouraged to respond. So it's not very helpful, even if you are diligent about making sure that you just present the basic gospel periodically in your sermons, for example. That's okay, but it's not as helpful as people in your church knowing when you're going to do that. Another example would be in the church in Sheffield I was in. One of my jobs at one point when I was on the team was to run centralized alpha courses. So we ran centralized alpha. In fact, I remember at one point we had about 100 people, all of them being served meals. We had a big team running it, people coming in, and we actually used that to spin some groups off. So people would come through alpha and then say, well, we want to stay as a group, But so something central that's happening, and it doesn't have to be every week. We're not talking about becoming an attractional seeker-sensitive church necessarily, but having times where everybody knows when something's going to be said centrally. That's one of the evangelistic tools. The second one would be resources that people can use in a small group type setting to take people over a few weeks through the gospel. So what we've got is we have a book that Chris Norman wrote called Seeking God Study, which is a 10-week Bible study. And we've had a lot of people come to faith over the years through the Seeking God Study. Now, in our culture, Midwest, it's still completely acceptable culturally to invite a neighbour to come and do a Bible study. I'm aware some of the people online, that would not be culturally acceptable in your setting. People would think you were mad. But still, we need some sort of resource in a group setting where people can take people through that process over a few weeks. And then the third one, so public one that people can bring people to, resources that people can use in a group setting. And the third one would be a simple teaching that everybody knows on how to share the gospel. So the way that Chris Norman has done it at our church is we talk about the 3 B's, which is beauty, brokenness, and birth. There are some people like that. Some people think that there's something missing there because they'd say, well, what about something about the victorious Christian life? Should there be bounty or something else in there? Or, you can argue about what it is, and there are better ones and less good ones, but everybody in your church being able to, on the back of a napkin, explain the gospel, it's really important, I think. So 3 levels of evangelistic tools. Any comments on that or questions on that before we move on? This is one of the least talkative webinar groups that I've had. So, okay. So this next one. Oh yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I think both here and in the getting the circle and triangle into the culture, for me has been, it's one thing for me to say it as a senior leader. People take it like it's a program, and
Yes.
they feel like they're doing something they're supposed to do, so it becomes perfunctory and they say it at certain times when they're supposed to, but it's not natural.
Yes.
So what's been helpful to me is God's raised up a few significant leaders that they are really good at dispensing this vocabulary, whether it's the tools or the circle and triangle,
Yes.
in the groups, because they're trusted people.
Yes. Yes.
I'm in here doing this. It's just like people sometimes only use tool language shapes in huddles. They're not integrating it into their life. So having other people authentically doing that. And then we've seen real breakthrough too when it happens with the kids. You know,
Yes.
the kids are most receptive. And when the kids do it, the parents see it, and it kind of opens up the door a little bit.
Yes. Very good. Yeah, really helpful. We found, I mean, I think that talking about the missional community end of it, I mean, doing multi-generational missional community with kids in the same mix, we would break down our community for prayer into smaller groups that are more kind of specific age groups. But having them in the mix in the conversation is really very helpful, I think. And they're often more evangelistic, and they're often more hard-hitting in what they say than the adults would be. I mean, I remember we were having a conversation with a missional community group this last year that probably was at least 50% non-believers, and we're having a conversation, and one of the Christian kids says, "Well, that's all very well, but what about hell?" You know, and we're like, "Oh, okay." We've been skirting around that, but you know, because there's a kid in the mix, they're suddenly bringing a much more hard-hitting conversation in, and of course, kids have grace to do that. Adults expect kids to say stuff that are slightly, you know, more challenging or slightly less easy to kind of ignore. So yeah, very helpful. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, so number 5 then for me would be.
Yeah, I had more.
Oh yeah, go for it. Yeah.
On the simple teaching that everyone can use, you said the one that you guys did is you wrote beauty, brokenness. I missed the last.
And birth.
And birth.
Yeah.
Do you have any other recommendations on tools like that, or?
Has anyone else got any examples of that? Simple ways to share the gospel.
We've used James Chung's 4-circle gospel, which is very similar. You can find YouTube quick explanations of that. It's the 4-circle gospel. I'll see maybe if I can find a link and post it.
Yeah,
I believe it's called The Big Story.
The Big Story.
Chung, The Big Story.
Cool.
Yeah, it's very good.
There's another one that I saw out the UK. I'm just trying to remember the name of it, but where they basically just used 4 icons that they would put on T-shirts, on wristbands, on everything. That was quite helpful. That came out of Frontline Church in Liverpool. I'd have to look it up, but again, I might be able to post it. I'll check it out. But that was quite a helpful one. That was quite fun because you could actually wear it, and it wasn't immediately obvious. It wasn't like one of the pictures was like Jesus on the cross. So people would ask you, what's that mean? And it gave you an opportunity to, you know, share it.
Is that similar to Alex Absalom's icons?
My guess would be that Alex probably has seen that at least. Yeah. I've not seen Alex's, but I'd imagine it's.
Tell me what the world's like when you turn on the news.
Oh, I don't think that was a comment, was it?
No, sorry.
Okay, cool.
It is called The Big Story. I found it. You can find it on YouTube.
Great, thank you. Appreciate it. All right, so let's just press on a little bit. So number 5, this one's a little bit more controversial, but I found it's really important. It's one-to-many discipleship, not one-to-one. And that's a tricky one, isn't it? I've just noticed someone's done a chat. Let me just. Oh, Charles, you've just posted that. Great. Unhelpfully, whenever a chat gets posted for me, it goes right on top of everything else, and I have to rearrange my entire screen again. So I might
Sorry, Paul.
No, it's good. It's that's helpful for you doing that. Thank you. This is a bit controversial because you get one-to-one one-to-one mentoring in churches generally that have a greater understanding of the importance of discipleship than most churches. So you get people recognize that imitation is important, that people need to learn through connection with other people, and so you get a model developed where you basically get a more mature Christian going and having a coffee with a less mature Christian, perhaps once a week, one-to-one. The great thing about one-to-one is you can be really honest about your brokenness and your sin or whatever, and you don't feel too self-conscious about it. And so a lot of people are very kind of wedded to that and very loath to give that up. And and the problem with that is it's not a multiplication. 2 problems for me. One is it's not a multiplication model. And the second one is it's not actually what Jesus did. So Jesus did do some one-to-one, but it was almost always a breakout of one-to-many. Even the reinstatement of Peter was a breakout of one-to-many. They're all sitting around the campfire eating, and then he says, hey, Peter, just walk up the beach with me a bit. And even then, John was following them, which is quite helpful because it means we get the account. But I mean, it's not that I'm suggesting that you kind of, take a hatchet to all one-to-one discipleship going on in your church. But I think that we really are trying to build a culture where we learn to be vulnerable enough to talk with authenticity and vulnerability about our lives with more than one person there. And the way that we build that vulnerability is by the leaders being prepared to be vulnerable. So, we're real about the fact that we're broken, as well as being healed, and as well as on the journey of following Jesus. And that helps other people to be more real. And the other thing is, I think that you learn, in a one-to-many discipleship context, like a huddle, you're learning from each other's situations and challenges, not just your own. And I actually think people grow more quickly in a one-to-many discipleship setting generally than they do in a one-to-one. So that one, you can get a lot of pushback in a church if you start trying to change that. But I think it can be a break on building a discipleship culture if you don't deal with it at some point. So any comments on that one?
Hey, Paul, I was just discussing this right before we got on here with someone. Just something that I've found helpful in our context was whether we're implementing these different pieces on the continuum, or doing kind of making space for the possibility of one-to-one discipleship, is kind of putting time limits on those things. So if you're going to have huddles in existence with some other form of discipleship, let's say, it's just being clear that the other form of discipleship that you're doing, or the group that you're involved in, it's got a start and an end date. It's not something that's going to go on forever. So, for example, if someone says, "Hey, Chael, would you meet with me one-on-one? This just happened to discuss something," I might say, yes, I'm willing to do that, but I will only do that for 3 or 4 weeks or something like that, rather than being locked into, we're going to do this forever and ever kind of thing. Because it feels like for many people, when they first go down this road of starting to implement missional community or huddle, it kind of has to be an all or nothing kind of thing. And then we exclude those other tools. Whereas there might be a way to incorporate some of those other tools and ways to do things, but to keep them limited in their focus and in their scope, so that we understand how they fit into the bigger picture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, very helpful. Yeah, thank you. Really good. Yeah. Any other comments on that, on the one-to-many discipleship thing? The thing I just add to that, by the way, is that you can have different levels of discipleship too. So I think it's important, when we're dealing with the slow track, it's important not to forget the long orbit. So, as a discipler, there should be a small number of people who are in a short orbit with you. That means that you're engaging with them somewhere between daily and weekly in terms of things like Bible, prayer, food, fellowship, those sorts of things, discipling others together, that you're somewhere between, I'm not saying you do it with them every day, but somewhere between daily and weekly. That's like a short orbit. Then you've got others, so that for Jesus would be the 12. Then you've got others like the 72. I would say that it's somewhere between weekly and monthly that you're engaging with them in those sorts of activities. And those would be, if you're in a missional community, the short orbit would be your core team. The mid orbit would be the rest of the community, probably, because you're probably meeting them once a week, most of them. But then you've got some other people you're really doing life with, the kind of core of the missional community. But in a church setting, if you're talking about people who are not in communities, it's really important that lots of people in the church have the opportunity to be in your home, say, maybe at least once in a year. Or say you've got a church of, if you've got a church of, say, between 200 and 300, I reckon you could get most people in the church in your home at least once a year. If you've got a church of, 150, you could probably do it more than that, 2 or 3 times in a year. if you've got a church of 1,000, then you probably won't get everybody through your home, but there probably are 200 to 300 key people that should, key connectors within the church that should be in your home at least at some point. And there's lots of different ways you can do that. I mean, in England, it used to be cheese and wine. You wouldn't do cheese and wine with church folks here in Indiana, but maybe you'd have a cookout or something like that, or you just have time. And, you know, whatever you want to do, whether it's just gathering people, thanking them for things they're doing, perhaps doing a little bit of vision, and perhaps doing a bit of consultation with them. What do you think? We're thinking about this. Just notice that you guys are all great teachers. What do you think about that from a biblical point of view? You know, whatever. It doesn't really matter, but it's getting some people. You know, when you're preaching on a Sunday, when people are interacting with you, when they're listening to you, if they've seen the inside of your house, the whole experience is different from them, even if only once. It's completely different from them than if they've never seen the inside of your house. So it's just worth being aware of those dimensions, the wider kind of cycles as well as the people that are kind of core people that you're discipling. Okay, number 6, this is a really important one, spiritual power. So we have to work on having a red hot center. And to me, building spiritual power in a church is really about 3 things. It's about building a prayer culture. It's about increasingly engaged worship. I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. And it's and some of you may not agree with me on this one. That's fine. We have a wide range of different kind of theological backgrounds doing 3DM stuff, but I would argue spiritual gifts, particularly the 2 big ones, which are hearing God, prophecy, and healing. To me, the prayer culture is both individual and corporate. So if, for example, you have a team at your church, do the team pray regularly together? Are you helping people to pray in their families? Are you encouraging people to have devotional rhythms in their own families around their table? I'm not talking about missional community leaders here. I'm talking about everybody. You know, are you beginning to have prayer meetings? So we've been gradually building it. Grace Gathering was a church when we first came about 5 years ago that really thought that prayer, most people prayed, but they prayed devotionally. And kind of it was almost like the unsaid thing was prayer changes me. And I think there wasn't a faith that, you know, like James says, the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. Or like I heard one pastor say, prayer is the heavy lifting. People at Grace Gathering definitely did not really believe that, certainly not as evidenced by their behaviour. I'd say now we're moving. We have now a monthly prayer meeting, as well as prayer going on in groups, and increasing numbers of people doing devotions in their homes together and praying for people of peace. And we've just joined with some other groups around the world in a prayer movement called Enough. And if you want to just if you want to check with me on that, I could connect you up with them. That's through a group called New Frontiers that came out of the UK, but they are a movement that runs in Europe, Africa, the States, and that's just, they just do 3 events a year, but they're events where you're doing a prayer meeting, but it's connected up with other people around the world. So we just did our first one of those a couple of months ago, and we went from going probably 3 or 4 years ago when we started prayer meetings, we got hardly anybody turning up, mainly staff. Probably a year ago, we would be having maybe 30 to 40 turning up. This is a church of about 1,000 people. For the Enough prayer night, which we invited children to as well, it was 8 through till 11. And we had food at the beginning of it, which is what they suggested that we did. We had over 150 turn up. So that's a big step forward for us. And the whole evening is intercessory prayer, praying for our community and so on. So building a prayer culture. The second thing, engaged worship, is about getting people to move from just enjoying listening to the worship and singing along to engaging with their bodies, you know, engaging in interactive practices, maybe prayers that people join in, maybe people raising their hands, maybe people kneeling, sometimes maybe people coming forward, times of worship that maybe have a wider range of things than just singing. Maybe there's some, you know, if your denomination can take it, maybe some dancing, maybe some art, but basically just a growing sense of worship is not something that people attend, it's something that people participate in wholeheartedly. And really, we've directed that from the front at Grace Gathering. We've said during this next song, which is a deep worship song, if you're able to, some people in the room may not be able to, but it might be an appropriate thing for us to kneel, for example. Well, that we had probably 2/3 of the room kneeling, and that's the first time probably most of them had ever knelt in a worship time. This is on a Sunday morning. So that one, and then the spiritual gifts. I think one of the big challenges for us, if we're really trying to see the growth of discipleship culture, and a culture where we're imitating Jesus, is that we don't kind of edit out all the supernatural bits out of the life of Jesus, but we recognise that they weren't just part of what Jesus did. They're part of what Jesus told us that we would do. John 14, anyone who believes in me will do the things I've been doing, and that they were part of his strategic direction. So, when he sent out the 72 in Luke 10, he said, heal the sick. I mean, that was part of it. And so just even things like having a prayer team at the end of church that people could go off to one side to receive prayer for healing, those sorts of things. Having times where you're doing listening prayer, not just talking at God, but having times to wait and seeing if anyone feels conviction. If your church isn't used to those things and you couldn't say what's God saying, which is a very evocative phrase, quite a provocative phrase for some churches, you might just use language of, conviction and prompting. What's the conviction of the Spirit as we read this passage or as we pray? Is anyone feeling that there's a bit of Lord's prompting them to share anything, or so taking people on a journey from wherever they are to a point where, at the end of the day, we want the church to be looking like the church in Acts, don't we? And it's been a privilege to be part of a church here where people have been on that journey and really committing to it. And there was one point where at an elders meeting where people were beginning to push back and saying, hang on, are we turning into a charismatic church here? What's going on with all these things? And Chris said, well, we've always been a biblical church, and we've always said we want our church to look like what the Bible describes. So what I'd like you to do is just read Acts and say, does our church look more like the church in the book of Acts than it did 2 years ago, or less like the church of the book of Acts? And bless those elders who are, I think, very Berean in nature. They're really, if you can show them something's in Scripture, they're up for it. It stopped the arguments there and then. They said, yeah, good point, Chris. And so we continued to move on, and we see people get healed, and we see people sharing things that God said, and so on. So that's a really big one, spiritual power. Any comments on that? Any comments or questions on that one? Okay. Number 7, this is a really important one as well, I think, is what I would say emerging generation at the heart of the church. So the thing about children and teens and young adults is that there's a number of things there. One is they're wired to take risks, which can be very annoying when you're having to look after them and raise them. But actually, I think is part of the way that God's designed them. And when the emerging generation are given a voice, and when they're given visibility, and when they're invested into in a really intentional way, in my experience, the whole church moves on more quickly in the things of God. For example, in that last one, we just talked about spiritual power. Your youth are going to be moving on in the spiritual gifts way before your adults are, if you're moving into those things, because they haven't got to unlearn all the stuff that we have to unlearn, where we've been kind of given a form of godliness without the power over years. So examples of how we've been doing that at the church I'm at the moment is we went through a season, we're not doing it right now, we went through a season about 2 years where we had a 5-minute slot before the sermon every week where we asked one of our teens to share either a testimony or a short piece of teaching that had impacted them. And so we'd have that young voice every week just sharing some stuff. That would be one example. We make videos of some of the testimonies and things of what's going on in our youth groups, and we show them to everybody. We started Form, which is a young adult 1-year internship where we're doing teaching and training. They basically come to church 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. The rest of the time they work to earn income. So they do Tuesdays, Thursdays, and some stuff at the weekends. And we really invest into them. We do training with them, discipleship training. We take them through processes, teach them up in and out. We huddle them. But the point, it's not just the training. It's the point is that every Tuesday and Thursday they're hanging around with all of the team. They're there in the church with us. They're getting goofy, playing their music too loud, making it feel like it's a family rather than just a professional environment. And as we've done that, this is now our third year of doing that. And it's really interesting how many more young adults we now have than we had 4 years ago, a lot more. And I think that as you begin to prioritize, when I say emerging generation, I mean children, youth, and young adults. Most churches have got at least one of those groups. Quite a lot of churches haven't got all three, but most churches have got at least one of those groups. And as you really invest into them and make one of the main inward dimension things that you do as a church to raise the next generation. And the other thing is about giving them responsibility and a voice much earlier than the church has traditionally done. I think it really helps. So, our daughter Hannah is 17. She's a junior at high school, or lower sixth if you're Brit, and she's running a missional community at her school. She's seeing a breakthrough. She went there as a missionary to the school because she felt God was calling her to. You're only going to have a small picture probably, so you might not see this, but there's a picture of Hannah with 4 of the girls from her school that she brought to faith this year. Hannah's the one on the far left, or this one, I don't know whether it's reversed. Next to her is a girl who's getting baptized this Sunday, and they've now got a discipleship group going. She's in full Christian leadership, even though she's just a teenager. And we've got 8 missional communities now in our church run by teens. And in the States, where you can't go into public schools and teach the gospel as an adult, that's a brilliant model because the students can. So it means that we don't have the restrictions that perhaps others might. So those would be the big 7 for me. There's probably a couple of others that I've noticed. If I was going to put on a number 8, maybe perhaps I'll do this in a slightly less strong colour, but it might be that you need mission to the wealthy and the poor. If you don't have that mixed economy of mission, I think it makes life difficult. If you only reach out to the wealthy, say you're a suburban church in middle class area, then you probably have enough money and you probably have a lot of great teaching, but you probably don't have many testimonies of people coming to faith because it's hard for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. I mean, when one does, they bring all their resources with them and it's really great. If you're only reaching out to the poor, you've probably got lots of amazing stories of transformed lives, people coming to faith, lots of baptisms, but you run out of money real quick. That was one of the problems we had in Sheffield. It's just really helpful if you can have a mixed economy of outreach. It's the last, the least, and the lost, isn't it? And that includes just about everybody who doesn't know Jesus. But it should include the least as well as the last as well as the lost, in my opinion. I love Dallas Willard's thing is the church on the church on the right politically has taken a very important thing, which is doctrine, and made it central, which it shouldn't be. Jesus should be central. And the church on the left has taken a very important thing, which is good works and social justice, and made that central, which it shouldn't be. Jesus should be central. And if Jesus is central, then we should see both of those things taking the right priority. And I think there's something there. And then the only other one, as a kind of extra, would be, I think, low risk, high grace mission projects. This is, again, these are for the people in the church who aren't in missional communities and things, but I put height grace, it should say high grace. So for example, something that we've found very useful at different times has been things like servant evangelism, doing free car washes, picking up trash in poor areas, serving homes and businesses, things like that, where we're basically getting people out there, people who've never thought of mission, they've never thought of engaging outside of their own church environment, prayer walking, getting people to do things that get them out and start to make them realize that mission isn't quite as scary as they thought it was. You can use those things to really bless a neighborhood or a region as well. But in my experience, it's as much of a blessing to the church as it is to the people that you're serving, because it begins to soften people up towards mission and gets them to begin to realize, wow, this isn't as hard as I thought it was. So there would be kind of 7 main ingredients, I think I'd call these, and a couple of extra ones, of things that you would do with everybody, while this is the kind of rub your stomach thing, while the pat your head is you're still investing in the few who really want to do missional communities and training them how to do that and investing in them and so on. But you're doing both at the same time, so that you're helping everybody to become a disciple at the rate that they're capable of going at. So we've just got just a few minutes left for any Q&A comments. So any kind of any reflections from anybody on any of those things, or any further questions to go a bit deeper into the detail, because this is a very big picture webinar, isn't it? Who's going to help us by asking some questions or making some comments?
Hey, Paul, can you hear me? This is John.
Hi, John.
How you doing?
Good to see you. I can't really see you. I can just see a kind of Last Supper kind of picture with a cross in the middle, but I'm sure you're there somewhere.
If you were to just look at these and say, hey, if I were to prioritize and, maybe we are, engaged in some of these various things, is there a sense of, boy, if I were to kind of just, obviously you got to, to a certain extent, you can't fight every front, but is there something that's kind of a priority, and would you say kind of the priority might kind of fall in line how you got those numbers?
Yeah, great question, John. To me, they're all, certainly those first 7 seem all equally important, but I think what I would do is I would look at them all, and I would say to the Holy Spirit, which I would ask the Lord to guide me. What's the order in which we need to address these? And I think that that's part of the skill that and the knowledge that comes, that discernment. You have to know your church in order to be able to do that. But basically, my job at Grace Gathering with Chris, so Chris is the senior pastor. My job over the last 4 years has basically been, I'm only employed a day and a half a week with them, has been to just say, I think we should address this next. The order that we did it in Grace Gathering was probably number 2 we did first, so preaching, teaching on mission, subject, community. Probably then number 6 we began to bring in prayer for healing. Then probably number 7 and number 3 kind of alongside each other. And then we began to realize that the missional communities for everyone didn't work, and we went after number 1. And number 4 we've kind of done in the last couple of years as well. So that was the number 5 has just been a general thing along, that's a background thing the whole time. So that's been the order that we've done it in. But I think that that's one of the things is I would recommend with your everyday folks kind of holding those things out. And there may be some other elements that I've not mentioned that God raises up for you, and just saying, okay, let's do a little analysis. If we were going to give ourselves a kind of, I don't know, a 1 to 10 on where we are with each of those, that might help. And what are the things that we need to really work on next? So I think that's definitely a conversation with the Holy Spirit that you process together as a team. Probably you're not going to want to work on all 7 at the same time, definitely. Just why it's a helpful question. Sorry if that's a bit of an equivocal answer.
One last quick question. If you're struggling to develop some communities in your church is kind of one of the destinations, is there some, what can we do today that will help us to live into that tomorrow? We're finding that step to be pretty big.
Sorry, I missed the question there. So I get that. Yeah, if we're trying to get to communities, what are you asking?
You're really struggling to get into kind of one of the end games of developing organic life-on-life communities.
Yes.
And so is there some steps, or what, again, kind of that phrase, what can we do today to
yes.
help us? Because for a lot, it just seems like, man, I'm just barely, I'm kind of in the 50s and I barely got energy to, get to church on Sundays. So
yeah. I would say there's a couple of things. One is you probably want some transitional things kind of there and here, if you're building that kind of continuum. So we, for example, have something that we call, to go from gatherings to groups, every couple of times a year, we have a mystery dinner, and we ask people to sign up, and you either sign up to be a host or sign up to be a guest, and you just basically get a whole load of people together to eat a meal together from the church in somebody's house. And it just means that, you know, people who've only been coming on a Sunday, which we have a lot, we're in church going Midwest, so people go to church on Sunday. We have quite a few people that are just Sunday attenders. It just gives them an opportunity to connect with some other people. So that would be an example of a gatherings to groups transition. We also have groups that we call discovery groups, which is just a 10-week sign up. So it's only going to run for 10 weeks. But what they do in those groups, and we have some of our key leaders lead them, is they do the things of missional communities. So you hang out together, eat a meal together, a potluck meal that you all share. Then you have a bit of a time of some sort of seeker-sensitive worship time. I mean, we've tended to just use Thanksgiving in ours, because if you've got people who are completely unchurched, that's still accessible to them. Everyone goes around and says something they're thankful for. And then a bit of low-maintenance Bible study. I mean, we've tended to, in our church, we've tended to use the Discovery Bible method. I don't know if you know that one, where you basically just read a passage and just ask some questions. The questions we use are, what did you like about that passage? What's it tell you about God? What's it tell you about you? And what should you do about it? What do you like about the passage? What's it tell you about God? What's it tell you about you? And what should you do about it? And we just have a bit of open discussion about that, and maybe then split down into smaller groups, maybe in the culture we have here, men, women, boys, girls, if you've got people to lead those, and have a bit of a 10 minutes of praying together into those things. So we do something like that, and we do it for 10 weeks, and it's really to give people a taster to see if a missional community is what they'd like to be in. So those sorts of things can be helpful. I think as well, it's worth being aware that missional community is not the end goal, certainly from 3DM's point of view. It's just a vehicle. The end goal is missionary disciples. The end goal is you want a church full of people who in any context will do whatever it takes to form community with others, live out a life that has a devotional rhythm with the Lord, and start to identify and reach out to those who don't yet know Jesus. And so sometimes it can be more helpful with some of your pioneer types to just get them to do family on mission lifestyle, rather than try to start with the more formal, full-on kind of missional community thing. You know, well, why don't you just find another person or another couple and just agree that you're going to meet together once a week and pray together, and just start to identify people in your neighborhood or in your kids' school or in your workplace, whatever it is, network or neighborhood. Just start to identify people who might be people of peace, and start to invite them to come and hang out with you a bit, see what happens. You know, so sometimes that kind of more organic start can be a more helpful start, I think, than the other one. The other thing I'd say is people in their 40s and 50s are usually the leaders in a church, so they're normally the go-to people to start this stuff. It's really hard for them. So you might find it easier to start this stuff with teens or with young adults, or, you know, other folks than with 40s and 50s. And then see if it grows from there. That's just another thought. And if you're interested in doing stuff with teens but feel like you wouldn't know how to do that, there's a 3DM ministry called Rebuild, run by Brian Gehrig, who's our youth pastor here in the US. And where, I mean, that's what they do. They train youth pastors how to do that stuff with teens.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
I know that we've just gone past time now. One last question from anybody, or are we good now for that webinar?
Hey, Paul, just a quick question.
Sure.
Number 6, I guess part C, the spiritual gifts.
Yes.
Is there any because I know what we need to grow in, but I'm not sure how to grow in it.
Sure.
I don't think I've ever had it really modeled for me well. And so, are there any resources or things? Practical stuff that we could do to start moving in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, there's a 3DM ministry called Naturally Supernatural.
Yeah, I haven't been able to go to one yet.
They'll do like workshops. I'm actually trying to write a book for each of those 4 workshops, and I'm about 3/4 of the way through the first book, and I've actually got a sabbatical this year in the summer, which is a writing sabbatical, and I'm going to try and at least finish that one and start the second one. Cool. So hopefully I mean, you know, it takes a while to get through. Hopefully by this time next year, there might be at least one 3DM book that helps us do that. But I'd say heads up stuff, probably even just doing some stuff on, I mean, I would say that Kath Lives's resources are very helpful. So there's a book called My Sheep Have Ears, which you can get off Amazon. That's a very helpful book. She was the person who headed up the growth of that ministry in our church in Sheffield. And there is a ministry in the US called Accessible Prophecy, which again, it's specifically designed for evangelical, non-charismatic churches that are moving into these things. So it's very biblical. It's trying to build a culture that's respectful and non-crazy, but at the same time really is trying to listen to what the Lord might be saying. The 3DM kind of emphasis on there is that anyone could answer the question, how's God getting my attention? Yeah. But in order to answer the question, what's God saying with authenticity, that has to be processed with other believers in a scriptural context. And that's how you get to that point. And so that protects against, individuals with some chip on their shoulder saying, thus saith the Lord. Mm-hmm. And so that's the kind of, I guess, the nub of how we would teach it, based on things like what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14, 2 or 3 prophets speak and the rest of the believers weigh what's said. It's that sense that in the New Testament era, you haven't got these individuals with this kind of incredible power to speak as the Lord's mouthpiece, but actually it's believers together that work out what it is the Lord's saying. So those guys, and if you're interested in the accessible prophecy, it's Brandon Kelley is the guy who runs that in the US, and I'll just see if I can find his email. I think he's got a 3DM email. Yeah, it's Brandon Kelley at 3dmovements.org.
Okay.
He's leading a webinar next week, I think, on Naturally Supernatural.
Is he? Oh, great.
Yeah. So probably find that.
And again, he's a denominational leader with Church of God General Conference. He's not come from a charismatic background at all. He's just on that same journey. So it's that same journey of how do we do this in churches that aren't used to doing it, but we know that we have to get there eventually, kind of thing,
Awesome. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, folks. I hope that was helpful. And I hope that's given you some food for thought. And if on the back of that you've got some kind of particular question you want to ask, you're welcome to drop me an email. It's I think you've had my email already, but it's Paul Maconochie at same as that other one, 3dmovements.org. I can't promise a long answer because it depends how many people write to me. But if there's something you just want me to you just want to check, or you want to just ask, if you want to process a bit more, then feel free to do that. I hope that's helpful for you guys.
Thank you, Paul.
Great. Thanks, guys. I'll look forward to seeing you again. Bye.
Bye.